swap at the front. Good morning. We're going to be beginning our new series. There we go. We're going to be beginning our new series leading up to Easter. And, you know, just like Advent, the church historically has celebrated the event and the anticipation leading up to the thing, and then had feasts and celebrations after. And, you know, in our culture, we tend to be rather terrible at anticipating events, aren't we? When you think about it, the closest you get is like bachelor parties and bachelorette parties before weddings. But generally, there's no celebration leading up. There's no anticipation and the sense of preparation leading up. We just kind of arrive and then we celebrate and try to extend the celebration. But historically, the church has always spent those 4 weeks of Advent preparing for Christmas. And then the Catholic Church calls it Lent, where this period, weeks before Easter or leading up to Easter, we prepare ourselves for the death and resurrection of Jesus. So this year, we are kind of in a similar fashion. We're going to look at that last week called Passion Week. We're going to look at the last week of Jesus' life that typically kind of spans triumphal entry to the resurrection. Now, so we kind of break it up into 6. I can easily just kind of chop it up. This week we'll talk about Jesus being the friend. Next week, Jesus the goat, the greatest of all time. How he is truth, how he is our answer, how he is our hope, and how he is our gift. Those are kind of the roadmap of where we're going from now to Easter. Now, interestingly, I'm titling the series kind of Seeing Jesus, because as we perceive Jesus, we start to understand who he is. And I think one of the biggest problems churches face is that our perception of Jesus is too small. Our God is too convenient. He fits in my pocket. He goes where I want him to go. He's not the God of everything. Our perception of Jesus is weak and small. And so today's sermon, Jesus as our friend, is going to focus on this segment of time between the Last Supper and the arrest. And so each week we'll look at a different chunk of time in here. So I'm really looking forward to what our other speakers are going to be bringing forward in this series. So Seeing Jesus. It's not for no mistake that when we look at the Gospels, they paint 4 very different pictures of Jesus. And sometimes people kind of like, hold on a second. It says this in that text, and it says this in that one. Like, why? Why do these texts not agree? And that's a great question. If you want to chase that one down, I'd love to have a conversation with you. I invite you to email me or phone me. We'll have a great talk about why the texts vary. But let's, on one hand, accept for a moment that these differences in the text are intentional. And that much like a stained glass window, they compose a picture of different pieces, like a mosaic. They present a picture that if it were just all the same, it would be too flat, too one-dimensional, one color only. And so having these different pictures of Jesus helps us see Jesus in a fuller sense. It helps you catch nuances in one text that isn't possible in the other text. So, for example, of the 4 Gospels, you have the 3 that are paired together called the synoptic, meaning the same vision, synoptic gospel, and the other one, John, which kind of stands apart and a little different. What's fascinating about this last week of period, John, more than half, actually almost exactly half of the Gospel of John is in this last week alone. So John puts an immense emphasis on this final week of Jesus. All the other gospel writers, 2 chapters. In Matthew, that comes down to less than 4%. In Mark, it's just over 10%. Right? So they put a huge emphasis on it, but not like John does. And John paints a lot for us. These different emphases, and these give us different nuggets of truth and this different perspective. And there's immense insight. And there is benefit in comparing them. For example, John shares the teaching and praying and perspective that the others lack. And yet John makes no mention of communion. But he does mention things that the other gospel writers don't about this time period. He mentions when Judas leaves the upper room. He also identifies Judas clearly to the group. As we talk about Judas and Jesus' relationship in this period, Mark is the only one that includes this strange one-verse encounter with some guy who's desperately underdressed in the garden. He's the only one. It's just this weird little drop in, but no mention of the betrayer before communion. He mentions the betrayer after communion. So Jesus in Mark, Jesus does communion with everybody, including Judas. Then he says, oh, by the way. Luke reverses it. Luke says, by the way, one of you are going to betray me. Okay, let's have communion. Let me start communion. And again, he doesn't out Judas. So today we're going to actually look at the Matthew text of this line. I'm sorry, I lagged a little bit there. So with this segment of text, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they each give it 2 chapters. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke give only 1 chapter to the raising of Jesus. So that's kind of how the texts are carved up. John is different. It gives 2 chapters to the raising and post-resurrection and a huge amount to the pre-resurrection. So let's look at today's text. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 26, 17 to 56. It's a huge chunk, but we're not going to look at all of it. We're going to be focusing mainly on verse 20 to 25, and verse 47 to 50, mainly verse 50. I want to really zone in on the interaction between Judas and Jesus. Because what we're seeing, to some extent, is that Jesus and Judas are sharing a private moment. They're sharing a private moment during these texts that the others don't seem to be hearing, don't seem to be connecting with. And it's only recorded in this text, in Matthew. So let's look at it. So Jesus is at the Last Supper. They sit down, they have dinner, they prepare for it. Jesus says he has to die. Then it says, starting at verse 20, when it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, is it I, Lord? To which he answered, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. And Judas, who would betray him, we're told, answers, just like everybody else, is it I, Rabbi? And he said to him, you've said so. So what does this tell us about Judas, this text? Well, first, Judas was a superb actor. Amazing actor. Jesus says, by the way, you group of 12, we've been together every day for 3 years. One of you is going to betray me, and nobody knew who it was. This guy was so good at acting, so good at pretending, nobody ever caught on. When it came to communion, he accepted the morsel, but not the love. And that's the problem. Sometimes liars can be hard to spot. And if you're navigating a dating relationship, I hate to say it, but it's often hard to know who you're interacting with in a dating relationship because they can hide. If you only see somebody at church for an hour a week on a Sunday, how easy is it to pretend for an hour? I mean, really? If you only see someone on a date for 3 hours once a week, how easy is it to pretend for 3 hours? You could be anybody for 3 hours. It's easy to white knuckle it and force yourself into this whatever you got to be for those 3 hours. That's why connection and community is important. But that wasn't Judas. Judas was actually such an impressive actor, such an impressive liar, that day in, day out for 3 years, and they never clued in. So that's the first thing that it tells us. Well, hold on. Didn't Jesus just out him? Didn't Jesus just tell all the disciples about this? Well, actually, if you flip over to John chapter 13, I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to scan over it real quick. The answer is no. In fact, it says that the disciples didn't understand. Verse 28, John 13:28 says, now no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Jesus kind of indicates that it's Judas. And when he dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas. And then Jesus says to Judas, what you're about to do quickly. And Judas, everyone heard him say that, but they didn't know why he said it. Some thought it was because Judas had the money and Jesus was telling him to buy what we need for the feast, or that he should go give something to the poor. And so John is the only one that kind of indicates and clearly demonstrates that nobody, even after Jesus kind of poked at Judas a little bit, even then nobody knew. And so after receiving the bread, he went up, and it was night. So first off, Judas was a great actor. Now, interestingly, Jesus says, hey guys, one of you is going to betray me. And all of a sudden, all of the disciples are like, well, is it me? Is it me? Is it like they didn't know? Were they kind of thinking they were going to accidentally do it? So the reality is that Judas was in good company. I think the disciples were humble enough to recognize that nobody is beyond hurting and betraying their friend. Did Judas out himself there? No. We can all be deceived, and we can be self-deceived and not know it. Like we can believe lies and not think that they're lies. That's just part of what it means to be human. And that's why community is important. And it often comes in a place of just not connecting, not understanding where we believed a lie. That's why discernment's important. That's why community is important. That's why questioning your teaching is important. And so Judas comes to him and he says, is it I, Rabbi? And I'm going to suggest one very important thing out of this. It wasn't that Judas was trying to figure out if he was the betrayer, because he already knew. I think what we're seeing is that Judas was trying to determine if Jesus knew who was going to betray him. Hold on, Jesus, one of us is going to betray you, right? Yeah, okay. Who? Which one of us, Judas? Which one of it? Is it me, Judas? Is it him? Is it him? Who is it? And so Judas knew he was going to betray Jesus, but maybe he was trying to figure out if there was anybody else. Maybe he wasn't alone in this. Maybe he wasn't just the sole dissatisfied voice. Because the reality is that Jesus shared his life with all 12. And it wasn't just Judas that betrayed him, was it? I mean, in the literal sense, Judas handed him over to the Pharisees. In the literal sense. But you can't tell me that Peter's denial in the courtyard 3 times wasn't a betrayal. You can't tell me when all of them say, oh, I would never leave you, and then within a few hours, they scatter like dust in the wind. You can't tell me that's not a betrayal. The reality is Judas was in good company. We are all betrayers of God. That's the bad news. When Jesus was distraught in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying with great drops of blood, everybody else was taking a nap. And when he shared his heart, they fled in the garden. So the only question then about this text that stands out to me is, when did Jesus leave? When did Judas leave? When did he jump ship on the meeting at the Last Supper? When did he leave? And none of the Gospels tell you when Judas leaves. None of the synoptic, the first 3, Matthew, Mark, Luke, none of them tell you when Judas left. In fact, the only one that does is the only one that doesn't mention communion, John. And it says, after the morsel was dipped in the cup and given to him, then he left. And then you have this incredible, amazing text where Jesus unpacks his heart and prayers and an understanding of the kingdom to the disciples. And then they go to Gethsemane. So Judas misses out on this deep, deep, beautiful text, this beautiful encounter with Jesus. Judas misses it. But we don't know when he left. I would be comfortable arguing, because it makes sense. Romans chapter 5, verse 8, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While we were enemies, knowing that we're enemies of him, Judas included, me included, you included, he offered communion. He offered the cup of forgiveness. He offered the blood and the body. He offered relationship and wholeness to someone broken. That fits with who Jesus is. That fits with the gospel message. That interchange right there. Jesus sitting in a room full of betrayers says, come and be forgiven, knowing it'll happen. So when did Judas leave? After he was offered forgiveness, I would argue. And he left. So let's look at our second text. So he has this encounter. Judas leaves at some point. They finish the Last Supper. They cross the Kidron Valley into Gethsemane, where Jesus frequently went to pray. It was one of his retreat spots. He says to the disciples, come pray with me. And Jesus, fast forward through the prayer, which is incredible in itself. I don't have time for it. But we hit verse 47, and he says, while Jesus was still talking to the disciples about prayer, about what's happening, while he was still talking, Judas came. One of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man, seize him. And he came up to Jesus directly, went straight up to Jesus and says, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, friend, do what you came to do. Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. You know, the Passion Week is where we see Jesus at his most human. But it's also where we see Jesus at his most divine. The depth of humanity and suffering and pain, but also the height of forgiveness and compassion and wisdom. And so out of this text we can look in, there's three things that we can see that are unmistakable out of this text. We're going to hone in on verse 50. Jesus says, friend, do what you came to do. First, Jesus treated Judas no differently. He washed his feet, just like all the others. Earlier on in John, he says, if you are my friends, he used the word philos, it's deep friends. You are deep, I love you, we're deeply connected. He set Judas at the place of prominence. When you're sitting at a table, they didn't have tables like we do with big table and a whole bunch of chairs. They had the low table close to the ground, and you tended to kind of lean on cushions at the table. And often you would lean against another person. And the way it's phrased in the Greek language is that it means you're kind of literally propped up against them. And so the beautiful text out of John is that it suggests that John had his ear close enough to literally hear Jesus' heartbeat while they were having communion. He was leaned so close into Jesus. And the one you dip your hand in the bowl with, that text that we see over and over and over again in this text, how far is your reach? 3 feet at best. The bowl that Jesus shared was with John on one side and Judas on the other. He gave Judas the second, or one of the greatest places of prominence. So Jesus not only didn't treat him any differently, he treated him with great love and favor. He offered him communion. And knowing that Judas would betray him, he still trusted him with the group's finances. Second, what else do we see about how Jesus treats betrayers? Well, we've already seen he offers forgiveness. He offered communion. Here he offered forgiveness again. Judas comes up to him and he says, Rabbi, to betray him, and kisses him. And Jesus says, friend, do what you're here to do. That term friend is not the same one used in John, where he says, you are my friends, no longer servants, but you are my friends. This term for friend is actually the same word that Plato used to describe his disciples. It was a little less personal, but it was still a word that meant we share something together that's precious. We share something of value that needs to be respected. It showed respect. And so, Jesus, in this moment, not only calls with truth, but he beckons with friendship. He says, friend, do what you came to do. I think implicit in Jesus' message there was the invitation to self-correct. Even then, even in that moment, Judas could have said, yeah, he's not here, guys. Oh no, I don't know where he is. Like there was still room for course correction. There was still an opportunity. And lastly, see that because of that, Jesus always offers a path back. You see, Jesus never did any harm to Judas, ever, only good. And this tremendous privilege that he had bestowed upon Judas, this massive potential and the best education that anyone could ever hope for, because you got to live with Jesus, this grace that was continuously offered, the healing was there to be asked for. Help of every kind was at hand for Judas multiple times, many ways. Judas spent all those years at the side of the Son of God, followed his very steps, hearing the words that came from his own lips. And even at the end, moments before betrayal, Jesus called him friend. In that moment, in that very moment, that path could have changed. He could have confessed his sin of betrayal, his sins of theft. He could have been forgiven and healed. There was no single point where Jesus ever excluded Judas, his enemy. No stumbling block, and never a bad word. In fact, the only person Jesus ever called Satan that was in the 12 was Peter. It wasn't Judas. And it was because Peter handed his mind over to the enemy in that moment. But here, he never did that. And yet Judas, without excuse now, has betrayed Jesus. And so as we close and we're talking about what it means to see Jesus, we can clearly understand that Jesus is truly the truest friend. I had picked actually the text today to refer to this out of Isaiah chapter 42, 1-9. A bruised reed he will not crush, a smoldering wick, or a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not crush. Like he's gentle with all of us. And yet at the same time, I'd also had another text which Marjorie read earlier, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1-3, looking to our author and finisher of our faith, he who holds us. Hebrews chapter 4. And again, we're painted the picture of this God who is the truest friend, who loves us while we were yet his enemy. He gave us his life for us. And so, where Judas had the best rabbi, the finest advisor, an amazing leader, an exceptional teacher, the wisest and best friend, the perfect counselor, and every opportunity, he failed. He failed to have faith. He failed to trust Jesus. He failed to receive grace. You see, the problem is not leadership. It wasn't Jesus' fault. And the same with you. The problem is not your church's leadership. The problem is not the church you go to. In a very real sense, we have to square what the reality is that we have to answer for our own faith and how we choose to act on it. Hardened and unrepentant in the face of kindness, privilege, love, and grace, Jesus went out and betrayed Jesus for change. 30 silver. And yet they all ran, they all betrayed. And so we end with this. All the betrayers of the truest friend. And maybe you've never been close to God. Maybe you're distant now. But the right path, the path to life, the path to restoration, the path to closeness with God, no matter how far you are or how far you've wandered, the path back is an immense journey of one step. Just one step for peace with God. One step to this true friend. It was a step that every disciple had to make when they ran to come back. They ran hundreds of steps that night, and yet in the upper room they took one step back to Jesus. It was a step that Peter struggled with and that Judas could not bring himself to. And that alone was the difference between a betrayer and a forgiven, taking that one step. If you've never taken that step, I invite you now. Jesus beckons us all to take one step, to go from betrayer to friend. The invitation has never been clearer and never more consistent. Join with me in prayer. Heavenly Father, I know that I am all too human, and I will let you down. You are the only one who cannot let us down. We all eventually hurt our own friends, our own loved ones, but you are the only one who is true. Jesus, help us to trust you and to love you. As we go from this place, Lord, may your grace continue to shepherd us. May we take the most of every opportunity to, as Marjorie has shared earlier, to turn our eyes upon Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, the fountain of life. May you be glorified, Lord. May we get a clear sense of your grace today. In Jesus' name, amen. And as always, go in grace.